Montana Territory, May of 1876. The rain had not stopped for 3 days straight when Whit Vance spotted the white figure walking the muddy trail alone. His horse, Dunbar, shifted under him, uneasy in the slick terrain. Whit pulled the reins gently and narrowed his eyes. The figure up ahead was not a ghost, not yet. It was a woman, soaked to the bone, her dress dragging heavy with mud, hair plastered to her face, and no coat to shield her from the cold drizzle. She looked lost. No wagon, no horse, no companion. Whit urged Dunbar forward. "Madam," he called out. She turned sharply, stumbling back a step like she thought he might mean harm. Her eyes were wide with fear, her lips blue from cold. She clutched something tight against her chest. Whit realized it was a small satchel, half torn open. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said calmly, keeping his hands where she could see them. "Name's Whit Vance. I just came down from Mine Creek. You lost." She stared at him for a moment longer, then finally nodded. "Once. Yes. I need help." Her voice cracked. She looked ready to collapse. Whit dismounted quick, mud splashing his boots. He approached slow, like you would a spooked horse. "Let me help you up. There's a logging camp less than a mile back. Got a fire, food. You'll catch fever out here." She hesitated, but then her knees gave out. Whit caught her before she hit the ground. "I got you," he said gently. She was light in his arms, shaking like a leaf. He lifted her onto Dunbar, then climbed up behind her, holding her steady with one arm. They rode in silence to the camp. Her name was Brielle Garner. She was 22, and she had been walking for nearly 2 days. "Where were you headed?" Whit asked once she had warmed up some, wrapped in a wool blanket by the fire. Her dress was drying nearby on a line. She had borrowed a shirt and pants from one of the men at camp, cinched tight at her waist. "I was supposed to get married," she said quietly, her eyes not meeting his. "In Bozeman. But his wagon turned back when the rains came. Mine didn't. Then the wheel broke. The driver left me behind when I couldn't pay more." Whit felt his stomach turn at that. He saw the way her hands twisted the blanket, holding it close. She had not just been abandoned. She had been thrown away. "You walking all the way to Bozeman?" "I do not know where I was walking," she said. "Just away." Whit leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You got folks out there?" "Someone waiting." She shook her head. "My parents died last year. I was living with an aunt until she married off her daughter to a rancher. Then she said I needed to do the same. So they arranged this thing in Bozeman. I met him once. And now?" She looked at him, eyes steady. "Now I am not going back." Over the next 2 days, Brielle stayed near the fire, helping cook, mending shirts, keeping quiet. But Whit noticed things. The way she laughed softly when one of the lumbermen told a joke. The way she hummed when she chopped carrots. The way she watched the sunrise through the trees each morning like it was something sacred. On the 3rd day, Whit saddled Dunbar again. "I am heading east toward Wolf Creek. Got a small place out there. Cabin, 2 mules, fence needs fixing." He looked at her. "You're welcome to ride with me." She blinked. "Why?" "Because you helped us here. Because you got nowhere else to go. And because I would not sleep right knowing you walked another step alone." She studied him for a long time. "All right," she said finally. "But I help with the fence." Whit smiled. "Deal." The trail to Wolf Creek took 2 days. The skies cleared, but the road was still thick with mud. They shared the saddle, taking turns riding and walking. Brielle never complained, not once. She asked about his land, his work, and listened carefully. She told him about her father's garden, her mother's bread, and how she used to read under the cottonwood tree before life got hard. At night, they camped under stars. Whit built the fire and Brielle cooked. They sat close, knees touching by accident, then not moving away. "Why are you out there alone?" she asked one night. Whit stared into the fire. Took him a moment to answer. "Had a wife. She died 3 winters ago. Fever. After that, I just kept moving. Built the cabin last year. Thought maybe I would settle." "And did you?" He glanced at her. "Not yet." She smiled faintly. "Maybe you just needed a reason." When they reached the cabin, Brielle stood in the doorway for a long time. The place was simple: one room, a stove, a cot, a table, tools stacked neatly. But it was clean. Safe. It smells like pine, she whispered. It is not much, Whit said. But it is mine. She turned toward him. It is more than I ever had. They fell into rhythm. Brielle planted herbs near the window. She swept, cooked, and patched Whit's torn shirt without being asked. Whit chopped wood, fixed the fence, taught her to ride Dunbar. She laughed more now. And so did he. One evening she spilled water on herself and let out a little yelp. Whit looked up from where he sat on the stoop. The shirt she wore clung to her skin. She froze, then stepped back, embarrassed. Sorry, he stood slowly, walked over, and gently touched her chin. You do not need to hide from me. Her breath caught. I am not hiding. She looked up at him, cheeks flushed, lips parted. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to move. She did not. Their lips met, soft and warm. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his chest. I never thought I would feel safe again, she said. You are safe, Whit whispered. With me. That night, she curled into his arms in the cot. His hand rested on her waist. Her fingers found his. They did not speak, but they did not need to. They had both lost so much. But in that small cabin, in the stillness of Montana's wild land, something new was taking root. Something steady. Something real. Whit had found her wandering on a muddy trail, cold and alone. But now, holding her close, he felt something bloom inside him he thought had died years ago. Peace. Hope. And Brielle? She had no past worth returning to. But now she had a man who looked at her like she was the answer to something he had not known how to ask. And maybe, just maybe, she was. By late June, the snow had melted from the distant peaks and the rivers ran full with meltwater. The cottonwoods along the creek behind the cabin unfurled their pale leaves, and the mornings smelled of damp earth and wild mint. Whit rose early, always barefoot, until he stepped outside. Brielle followed not long after, her braid trailing down her back, eyes still heavy with sleep. She never said much at dawn, but she always leaned against the doorway for a moment, watching him saddle the mule or sling a pail over his shoulder. It was a quiet rhythm. No promises spoken, just the steady weaving of two lives. One morning, as Whit repaired the gate on the far side of the pasture, Brielle approached with a tin cup of cool water and a folded cloth. She didn't hand them over right away. Would you teach me how to mend it myself? He glanced up, surprised. You want a patch fence? I want to know how, she said. In case you're away sometime. He set aside the hammer and stood. All right, start with the rails. This one's too loose. You'll need to wedge it tighter before you drive the nail. She set down the cup and picked up the hammer. Her grip was clumsy, but her expression was steady as she crouched beside the post. Press there, he said quietly, guiding her hand. Good. Now swing. She missed the nail on her first try and let out a quick breath. He didn't laugh. She tried again. This time the hammer struck true. There you go. She looked up at him, and there was a flicker of something proud in her eyes. That evening, they sat at the table with a pan of roasted turnips between them. Brielle's hands bore a few new blisters, and Whit's shirt was damp at the collar, but neither of them minded the silence. After the meal, she brought out a small book frayed at the corners, pages foxed with age. My father gave this to me when I was 12, she said. He said every woman ought to understand the world beyond her doorstep. Whit leaned closer. The cover was plain, but the text inside was carefully penned. Geography? He asked. And botany. Some family history, too. She turned a few pages, then paused. My grandmother crossed here from Illinois. Lost 2 children before they reached the Missouri. But she kept going. I used to read this when I felt like I wasn't strong enough. Whit reached across the table, resting his hand beside the book. You are. She didn't look up, but her fingers brushed his palm. Later, as they walked the edge of the creek, Brielle stepped carefully over the slick stones. Her skirt was pinned at her knees, and her boots were caked with silt. She crouched suddenly and plucked a small plant from the water's edge. Arrow leaf, she said. Edible roots. Bitter, though. You know plants. My mother taught me. She straightened. She said everything growing wild has its use. If you know how to look. Whit nodded slowly, watching her fingers trace the leaves. You ever think about keeping a garden here? He asked. I have. She didn't smile, but there was something settled in her voice. A firmness that hadn't been there weeks ago. When they returned to the cabin, the light was fading into the long gold of midsummer. Whit lit the lamp and Brielle closed the shutters. As she reached for the last one, she paused. There's a letter, she said quietly. I've kept it in my satchel. She moved to the cot and pulled the flap open. From inside, she drew a folded paper, its edges worn. She held it out to him. It's from the man I was meant to marry. Whit didn't take it right away. You want me to read it? I want you to know. He said I wasn't what he expected. That I'd be more trouble than I was worth. Whit's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. He was wrong. She breathed out, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. I burned the rest of his letters. But I kept this one. To remind myself that I left on purpose. I didn't just get abandoned. I chose not to stay. Whit placed his hand over hers, pressing the paper gently back toward her chest. You don't owe me proof. I'm not offering proof, she said. I'm offering truth. He looked at her then, steady and sure. All right. She folded the letter again, slower this time, and tucked it back into the satchel. Then she turned and leaned against his chest, her head beneath his chin. The lamp flickered on the wall, throwing soft shadows across the floor. Outside, the creek kept whispering. Whit closed his eyes, his arms wrapping around her waist. She fit there easily. A quiet presence. A steady weight. Inside the stillness, they stayed. Neither of them spoke of love. It didn't need naming yet. But something had shifted. She had asked to learn the fence. She'd shared her book. She'd handed him the worst of her past. And he had not turned away. Whatever path lay ahead, it would not be walked alone. By July, the wind softened and the grass on the far slope turned the pale gold of late summer. The days stretched long and the work turned steady, less about surviving, more about shaping something lasting. Brielle stood with her sleeves rolled above her elbows, sharpening a draw knife against the stone Whit kept by the porch. She had taken to handling the smaller tools herself, carving handles and stakes from split cedar, her grip precise now, confident. Whit passed her with a coil of rope slung over his shoulder and paused. You plan on whittling the whole barn from scraps? I plan on making sure we've got enough pegs to finish the roofline, she said. Unless you'd rather hammer nails into air. He laughed low in his throat, then adjusted the rope. I'll cut another beam this afternoon. That north corner's still sagging. She watched him start toward the tree lean. Wait. He turned. You sure you want to keep that old beam? I saw signs of dry rot near the base. Whit tilted his head. You check it this morning? Before breakfast. He nodded once, then shifted direction without another word. They moved like that now unspoken plans shared through habit and small glances. Brielle had started keeping a ledger carved into a piece of pine plank beside the stove. She marked rows for what they'd planted, what had taken root, what hadn't. She pointed at it one evening, after they'd come in from hauling stone. I think we need to build a root cellar. If we're staying through winter, we'll lose too much without one. Whit leaned against the door frame, brushing dust from his forearm. You want to dig it near the creek? Too damp. I was thinking the slope behind the shed. That bend stays shaded. He looked at her, then not at the plan, but at the woman drawing it out with her finger, her brow slightly furrowed, her mouth intent. You think about staying often? He asked. Her hand stilled. I don't think about leaving. He crossed the room slow, his boots quiet against the floorboards. You ever miss the towns? Bozeman or before? She didn't look away. I miss hot bread. A mirror. Bathing without hauling buckets. But I don't miss being spoken over. Or feeling like someone else's burden. Whit's voice was quiet. You're not that here. I know. That night, she pulled an old quilt from the chest and spread it in the field behind the cabin. The stars had begun to show themselves, faint at first, then in clusters across the sky. Whit brought 2 mugs of boiled chicory and sat beside her, knees drawn up. She reached for his wrist and guided his hand to a scar that ran along her ribs, half hidden beneath the hem of her shirt. I fell from a wagon when I was 17. Broke 2 bones and split skin deep enough to see white. My aunt said it was my fault for riding too close to the edge. He didn't pull away. What did your father say? He wasn't alive to say anything. Whit's fingers brushed the line of the scar gently. I'd have pulled you up before you slipped. She exhaled, long and soft, and laid her head against his shoulder. Neither of them moved for a while. After a time, she asked, "Why'd you build the cabin here? This spot, I mean." He watched the wind shift over the grass. First time I stood here, it was quiet enough to hear birds settle in the trees. I needed quiet back then. I didn't think I'd ever want anything louder. And now, his thumb traced the back of her hand. Now I wouldn't mind 2 voices sharing it. She turned her face toward him, eyes catching the starlight. You want a family? I want what grows honest. If that's just us, that's enough. If it's more, I'll build the walls high enough to hold it. She leaned up then, lips brushing his jaw, then his mouth. It wasn't rushed. It was the kind of kiss you give when you've chosen someone, not just wanted them. When they parted, she whispered, "Then let's build it." Morning came with the smell of dew and ash and the faint call of grouse beyond the ridge. Whit stepped outside and found her near the shed, sleeves rolled, already clearing ground. He didn't speak. Just fetched the spade, walked over and dug beside her. They didn't need vows. The work was their promise. Each beam, each planted seed, each shared silence. And the path they walked, muddy at first, uncertain, had become something firm beneath their feet. She hadn't just guided him to a brighter path. She'd built it with him, one quiet day at a time. By early August, the first signs of the season's turn were whispered in the wind, cooler in the evenings, sharper at dawn. The sun still held its strength at midday, but shadows lengthened sooner, and the birds nesting in the trees behind the shed had grown quieter, more watchful. Whit came in from the north ridge with a fresh kill slung over his shoulder, a young buck, clean shot, meat enough to fill the smokehouse. He found Brielle bent over the stone basin near the back window, sleeves damp, her arms streaked with flour and ash. When she heard the door open, she didn't turn. You'll want to hang it quick. Temperatures dropping faster this week. He leaned the rifle against the wall and wiped his brow with a kerchief. You read the air better than the clouds. She finally looked up, a faint line of soot across her cheekbone. There's a scent of cold if you're paying attention. He stepped closer, the smell of pine and blood still clinging to his shirt. I've been thinking, she said, before he could speak again, we ought to look at reinforcing the stove before the frost comes. The seams are loose near the backplate. He studied her face. You worried it won't hold? I'm thinking of winter mornings. You waking before dawn, me trying to get bread to rise. I want the heat to stay in. He nodded once, then reached out and touched her waist, fingers brushing the edge of her apron. I'll fix it. Before the first frost. She rested her hand on his chest, just above the collarbone. I know. That night, after the meat was prepared and the coals banked low, they sat outside with plates on their laps, the last of the marrow broth still steaming. Brielle traced her thumb along the rim of the tin cup and watched the dark line of hills in the distance. You ever think about what this place will be like in 10 years? She asked. Whit leaned back on his elbows. Not until now. I do, she said. I see the fence stretching farther east. Chickens near the cedar grove. Maybe a bench near the creek. He turned toward her, one brow raised. You planning on staying that long? She didn't smile. Instead, she said, I'm planning on staying longer. He reached for her hand, callous now, but warm. Then I'll need to build the bench solid, won't I? The following morning, they hitched the mules and traveled west along the logging route, not for need but for trade. Brielle had carried a bundle of dried herbs and a stack of sewn cloths she'd bartered from a woman in the southern valley. Whit brought preserved meat and a few lengths of cured leather. The trip took them through a narrow pass lined with black rock where the trees grew close and the light filtered thin. At a homestead 2 days out, they exchanged goods with a quiet couple raising goats. Brielle spent time with the woman, learning how to stretch goat's milk into soft cheese, while Whit helped patch a broken hinge on the barn gate. That evening, under a cotton blanket stitched in green thread, Brielle laid her head against Whit's chest and whispered, "There's a stillness in these days I didn't think I'd ever feel again." He pressed his lips to her hairline. "You gave it to me first." When they returned to the cabin, they brought more than goods. Brielle carried a small jar of the cheese she'd helped make and a handful of seeds wrapped in muslin beans the woman said that withstood the cold better than most. Whit brought home a hand tool for trimming hooves and a second rifle, older but reliable. They didn't speak of what these things meant. They simply stored them as people do when they plan for seasons still ahead. The rhythm of the days deepened. Brielle began rising before Whit, her feet soft across the floorboards as she lit the stove and stirred the pot. She no longer paused before touching his shoulder to wake him, no longer hesitated before entering his quiet. One evening, as a thunderhead rolled low along the horizon and the smell of tallow drifted from the lantern, Whit sat carving a new yoke peg while Brielle mended the strap on her bag from months before. "I want to ask you something," she said suddenly. He set the knife down and looked up. "All right. There's a man in town, Mr. Eddings. He's the old stationer. When we passed through last, I noticed his store was closed. The sign said, 'For sale.'" Whit's brow furrowed. "You thinking of buying it?" "No, but I was thinking. Maybe we could use the space. Not for trade, more like a place folks could come for things they can't find at the post. I could keep plants there, dry herbs, maybe keep books for lending." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood and crossed the room, crouching beside her. "You want to run a place like that?" "I don't need to, but I think it could matter. There are women out here with no one to teach them how to do what we've learned. I'd like to help them feel less afraid." He brushed her hair back from her cheek, eyes steady. "Then we'll see about buying it. Together." She nodded once, and for a long while they stayed there, the only sound the wind sighing through the shutters. That night, for the first time, she took a piece of paper from her satchel and began to write, not from pain, not to remember loss, but to mark the beginning of something new. And beside her, Whit slept with one hand resting palm up on the pillow between them, open and waiting. She slipped her fingers into his as the lantern flickered low. No words were needed. Some paths weren't found all at once. Some were built step by step, hand in hand. By the time the aspens began to yellow along the ridge and the nights grew still enough to hear the coyotes pacing distant ravines, the cabin felt fuller, not just with food put by and wood stacked high, but with something quieter, sturdier. The pulse of a life built, rather than waited on. On a chill morning with frost silvering the grass, Whit stood at the edge of the field, watching the mule team strain against a load of split larch. Brielle stepped up beside him, pulling a shawl tight over her shoulders. "I heard from Mrs. Thorne," she said, her breath clouding between them. "The woman with the youngest boy who's been coughing." He turned to face her. "She send word in person? Her eldest rode out yesterday. She says the boy's fever's broken, but she's still got no medicine on hand. Wants to learn how to grow her own." Whit nodded once. "You thinking of riding out there?" "She's 2 valleys east. I could be back before dusk. I'll come with you." She shook her head. "You've got the barn beam to set, and she's asked for herbs, not fence work." His brow creased, but he didn't argue. Instead, he led her back to the porch and fetched a wrapped parcel from the shelf beside the door. "Take this, then. From my mother's Bible. It's pressed wild thyme from the first spring I spent here. It always helped her lungs." Brielle took the parcel gently, then reached up and fastened the button at his collar, her fingers lingering just a breath longer than needed. "You trust me out there on my own? With you, I don't find trust hard." She kissed his cheek, then mounted and rode into the rising light. He watched until she crested the low hill, her braid trailing down her back, her figure small against the sky. Then he returned to work, the ache in his chest not from worry, but from knowing he missed her even when she was only just gone. When Brielle returned near dusk, her cheeks were wind-chafed, but her eyes were bright. "She's got a good patch of land. I marked where she should plant coltsfoot and yarrow come spring." Whit helped her down from the saddle. "You bring anything back?" "Just this." She reached into her satchel and pulled out a folded square of fabric. The boy's sister sewed it. Said it was payment. He turned it over in his hands, a small cloth with uneven stitches forming the shape of a tree, crooked and strong. Later that week, they rode into town together. The stationer's building stood quiet, its windows filmed with dust. Brielle pushed open the door and stood still, surveying the space. The shelves were bare. A few nails jutted from the walls. Light slanted in through a cracked window, catching the dust and gold motes. "It'll need scrubbing," she said. "And a stove that doesn't lean. I want to keep the sign." "Just add to it." He stepped behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "What would you name it?" She leaned back against him, her voice low. "The Wild Root? For what grows deep even when you can't see it yet." He rested his chin on her shoulder. "Then we'll paint it together." They bought the shop outright 2 days later, exchanging salted meat and dried beans to cover part of the cost. Whit hauled in shelves from a shuttered dressmaker's, and Brielle filled them slowly, one with jars of dried herbs, another with hand-stitched pouches of seeds, a third with books she'd gathered from women in nearby homesteads who'd long since taught their daughters to read. In the back, she kept a cot and a kettle for tea, and women began to come, not in flocks, but steady. They came with questions, with bruised hands, with infants coughing against their collars. Brielle listened, offered what she could, and never once turned anyone away. Whit kept up the cabin, rode into town when the weather wasn't bitter, and built a bench for the creek, just as she'd imagined. On Sundays, they picnicked there with bread and pickled beans, and sometimes they read aloud from her father's book, taking turns with the pages. One evening, after the first snow fell and the shop closed early, Brielle lit the stove in their home and sat beside Whit by the fire. "I think I'm ready," she said quietly. He looked up from the tin cup in his hand. "For what?" "To marry you." He set the cup down. "I didn't want to ask until you were sure," he said. "Not because it was owed or expected. I want it because I've built something with you that I never believed I'd have." He reached for her hand. "Then let's not wait." They married beneath the cottonwoods, the ones that lined the creek where she'd first spoken of staying. The sun filtered through the bare branches, and the wind held still long enough for her to say the word steady. Just them, the preacher from the mining camp and a witness from town, hands clasped and eyes full of something that needed no explaining. That night, in their cabin, she unpinned her hair and let it fall loose around her shoulders. He held her as though she were the only warm thing left in the world, and she touched his face like she was memorizing something already hers. Seasons passed. The shop grew. So did the garden behind the cabin. Brielle taught girls to read and women to heal themselves. Whit kept the land in order, built an extra room, and carved a cradle with his own hands. They named their daughter Lillian after the plant that blooms late and holds through frost, the kind Brielle said always came back stronger after each winter. Their love never needed grand words. It showed in the way he filled her kettle before she asked, in how she sewed his shirts with care even when no one would see the inside seams. They grew old with calluses and laughter and the quiet certainty that no part of their life had been borrowed. It had all been chosen. Together. And it was enough. It was everything.